Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a brief review on iTunes or by simply becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Professor Brian Boyd. Brian is a distinguished professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. His work has appeared in 20 languages and has won awards on 4 continents. But most importantly for our conversation here today, Professor Boyd is the author of On the Origin of Stories, which is a book that looks at the evolutionary origins of story by examining the connections between evolution, cognition, and fiction. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Brian.
It's a pleasure to be here. By the way, I am speaking from the future. I'm tomorrow by your standards, so it seems appropriate.
That's fantastic. Yes, indeed. You are speaking from tomorrow. 16-hour time difference. Okay, so Brian, why do you think any of us should even care about story?
The thing is that we can't help but care about story. It's in us from the moment we understand language, I think, and perhaps even before we understand language. Children watching things move around on a screen will be captivated. We don't have a choice. It's just deeply inbred in us, I think. Innate, I would have to say, yeah.
Lisa Cron says that we are, quote, wired for story, which is the title of her book. So I totally agree with you, of course. And perhaps before we dive into the very details about story, and especially its evolutionary origins, let's talk a little bit about Brian's story. What is your story, and how did Brian Boyd discover story?
Discover story as something to write about from an academic point of view, or discover story as a child?
Both, perhaps, because I think they're both perhaps connected.
Yeah. Well, curiously, my memories of childhood stories are not all that rich. I suppose my parents read stories to me. I remember being interested in Bill and Ben, the Flower Pot Men, on BBC Radio when I was growing up in Belfast. But we lived, when we came to New Zealand when I was 5, we lived in a small town called Foxton Beach, a 700 population, no public library, and my parents didn't have many books in the house, so I read a few. I think it was the Bobbsey twins and the famous 5, things like that. When we moved into Palmerston North, where I stayed through my high school years, which is a town of about 70,000 now, I started frequenting the local library, but my parents also had a little corner store, convenience store, where it was my duty to check off the magazine orders for our regular subscribers, and I would read every magazine as I was supposed to be checking them off. So it would be schoolgirl comics, war comics, anything. It didn't have to be comics, but multi-part encyclopedias, whatever. I would just devour it. And I think that got me got a very high dose of story into me quite quickly. I kept on looking for more sophisticated things gradually at the local public library, and let's see. I became very interested in Nabokov in my last year at high school, and then in my second year at university, in John Barth, the American novelist, who was very interested in the origin of story from a kind of literary point of view. So he he was a librarian at when he was a student, and was fascinated by the Sanskrit ocean of story, which is, I don't know, 100 volumes or so, with stories within stories and so on. And he works his own stories, especially his later stories, in ways that reflect this. And so I became fascinated with the origin of stories in that way, which is quite a different kind of way from the way I later got onto it.
So you got interested in fiction first, and where did the sort of academic interest come into, and especially perhaps the framing of that interest within the theory, Darwin's theory of evolution?
Okay, well, I did my PhD on Nabokov at Toronto, and also at the same time got very interested in Karl Popper, whom I'm working on a biography of now. Popper's interest in evolutionary epistemology appealed to me incredibly at that early stage, and by the time I got an appointment at the University of Auckland in 1980, I was reading science a lot, and reading, say, Stephen Jay Gould, and perhaps a little later Dawkins. In the 80s, I was mostly working on Nabokov's biography. When that was finished, I was going to do a book on Shakespeare, but my work wasn't fashionable enough. It wasn't interested in postmodern theory. I'd been immunized against that, I think, by both Nabokov and Popper. And so let's see. There are a couple of things happened in very close succession, although they weren't related. A friend suggested that I read Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct in 1994, and I became interested in evolutionary psychological explanations of things. And I think it was perhaps in 1993 that I read Spiegelman's Mouse, and immediately saw, wow, I want to teach a course in narrative that covers as many different media as possible, covers as wide a historical range as possible. And I started to put my course in narrative and my developing interest in evolutionary psychology together. I didn't actually work on it until I did one. I was teaching Jane Austen as part of this graduate narrative course, and I did apply evolutionary psychological ideas to that in a way that I think now are perhaps a bit crude. But I then got a fellowship to start the Popper biography and was trying to work on that, but still had lots of Nabokov material to get out of the way. And then somebody invited me to speak on a panel with Steven Pinker in the Arts Festival in Wellington. And I thought I'd better brush up my knowledge of evolutionary psychology. So I did, and I woke up thinking I had a brainwave. I could write a book on the origin of stories in 6 months. I've written books in 6 weeks, but that's on Nabokov, on whom I know a lot. And I said to my wife, I'm going to be diverging from the Popper biography. I'll do this. I'll get it over within six months and get back to Popper. But it took about 8 grueling years, chasing my tail, it felt like, for most of the time, before I finished on the origin of stories. And then there was an aftermath to that, so I wrote another book. I was going to write a sequel to On the Origin of Stories, taking examples from Shakespeare to Spiegelman. And I started with Shakespeare, thinking I needed to deal with his sonnets, and that was going to be a chapter in this book. And it turned out to be a book in its own right. So
that's how it usually works, right? We tend to underestimate the challenges, and which is why we jump in, and then we figure out when it's like we're neck deep that there is no way coming back, right? That's what happened with my own first book and now with the second book. I crashed my first book probably in about 1 month, and it kind of almost destroyed me physically. I mean, I was doing research for it for about 7 or 8 years, but I actually did 90% of the actual book work in about a month. And then my wife asked me not to do that again.
Well, that was the same with the book that I wrote in 6 weeks. It destroyed my nerves in my back. So yes.
Yes. And then I decided to write a book on story for a change, on rewriting the human story. And so here we are talking to each other today. And by the way, your book on the origin of stories would play a major part in my chapter on the biology of story. So I really appreciate that. But just to sum up our kind of personal part of the conversation about who Brian Boyd is, if you were to sum up yourself in a sentence, who is Brian Boyd? Are you a storyteller? Are you a critic? Are you a professor, an academic?
Somebody with a lot of curiosity that I've had the opportunity to pursue in as far as I can, a blessed opportunity in all sorts of different directions that don't connect. Yeah.
I can totally relate to that myself, because my curiosity is also kind of very inconsistent, perhaps, and way all over the place. And while that's very easy to critique, I venture to say that it's a lot of fun, and I'm loving the ride.
It keeps you refreshed.
It exactly right. It's always interesting. It's always fun, and I'm always looking forward to it. So it's fantastic. Now, let us go into the meat of the matter here, though, and let us start talking about story. So, like any proper scientific conversation, we have to begin by defining our subject matter. So, what is story, Brian, and how do you define it?
Well, actually, I'm working on Popper's biography, and Popper insists that definitions are unnecessary. He hates definitions, and I've come to be a little of that ilk myself. I mean, story can mean anything that's related of concrete events. I think it's usually told as if it's in the past, even though it may be set in the future. Let's see. So I would say a report of a specific set of events that would be about all you would need, really. And in order to be worth telling as a story, of course, it has to be something a little out of the ordinary. A routine description of your going to the local supermarket and coming back would be of no interest, not even to your wife probably. But something, if somebody behaves freakishly at the supermarket, it may become worth a story. And on the other hand, something that is a mere description of absolute routine that is generalized is again not quite a story. It's a pattern, but it's not individualized enough to be a story.
Mm-hmm. Let me venture a kind of a definition that I'm kind of working with, and offer it up for your critique, because you're much more experienced and you're a distinguished professor. You've done fantastic work. So how about this, and see if it's going to make sense to you. My working definition is that story is an information processing technology. It's about information, because there is a transfer of knowledge or information or data from one person or to another, from one generation to another, from one place to another. Secondly, it's about processing, because, as you said, it is not a mere description of the events, but has to have this kind of a surprising element, this kind of counterintuitive element, And it usually has to have some kind of a moral of the story, some kind of a point that perhaps we didn't even expect. Somewhere in the subtext, something that we take away with that goes beyond the sum of all the data that is contained in that story, right? So that's the second part. So it's about information, then it's about processing that information, and finally it's a technology because it's a kind of a invention or a creation of the human mind. It does not exist outside of our imagination. It is not a material object that exists in the universe, but it's a child of our minds. It's a child of our imagination. It doesn't exist out there in the universe. So, and of course, I go a lot more of unpacking that. But does this make sense to you at all? And how would you critique it?
Well, the last comment that it doesn't exist outside our head, you're talking about fiction here, and right? And I think if you're accounting for a story, you also have to account for non-fiction, for reports, gossip, history, legend, which may include elements of fiction, but they may not be considered as such. So it may exist outside your head. What you're describing may have been a real event, and yet it can still be a story. So we have to be clear when story is a vague term that can include fiction or it can include other non-fictional narratives.
I differentiate it from chronicles, for example, because chronicles are a mere description of events. But that's the birth of history. The birth of history is when we go beyond mere chronicles, merely describing what happened, but actually ascribing a meaning that goes deeper and further than the events themselves, a meaning that helps us connect the dots, right? And that's where I say the processing comes in, and that's where I say it's also a child of our imagination, because the events and the objects in the universe do exist. They're objective, but the interpretation, the moral of the story, is subjective.
Yeah, you seem to be implying that there's a moral put in there by the teller, and that it's necessarily conveyed to the audience. I'm not sure if that's what you were implying, but to me, people interpret stories in so many different ways. Obviously, storytellers shape them to elicit a certain kind of response, but audiences interpret them in ways that matter to them, and they may take all sorts of different levels of implication out. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about stories, that they can have a psychological aspect. This is how people think, a kind of behaviorist element. This is how people act, and it might have a moral implication. So this is how people should act or do act and get punished for, and so on. So I think that the range of implications from stories is very, very open-ended. Even though I suppose as a critic I tend to go for an authorial interpretation, but I think there's an example maybe you wanted to come back to later, but in my book of a famous film by two psychologists, Heider and Zimmel, in 1944, which shows three moving shapes and one stationary shape, in a black and white movie that's only about a minute and 40 seconds long. Two triangles and one circle, and they move about on the screen. The stationary shape has a flap on it, and virtually everybody sees it as a story of two friends, or perhaps two partners, romantic partners, who meet a bully who
I love triangle.
traps. Yeah, the big triangle is the bully, and the smaller triangle is the partner of the circle. The circle gets trapped inside this shape with a flap, which we read as a house, and virtually everybody reads it as that kind of a story, and that's exactly what the psychologists intended, and they were trying to show how enormously richly we infer from very, very minimal evidence. So we identify these as people, and identify them as different morphs of people, if you like, so male and female. And some people, I've done this in my class, and I was a bit aghast when one student in particular saw it as a father about to beat up his daughter. This is a woman student. So yeah, but this is an example of both how convergent interpretations can be and how divergent at the same time, that somebody can come up with that kind of a response.
Yeah, I think that example that you have in your book, which is a famous example, shows our proclivity to create stories even there aren't ones, and to ascribe meaning to perhaps events that are not necessarily connected and that do not necessarily have a meaning for us in our world. To ascribe a cause and effect kind of a narrative, or to invent it and to create it. And that creates that proclivity for us to both create and interpret story. But my definition wants to propose, while not denying that there is this kind of audience power to interpret freely, my definition proposes perhaps, or creates the space where both of those are true. So the author of a story, and I wouldn't call that the Triangle movie a story under my definition.
I would.
Well, that's very interesting. Yep. So maybe we can talk about that later, but I personally wouldn't. I would give it as an example of our proclivity of the minds to create stories where there aren't any. Just like, for example, if you said you're probably going to have a cyclone in your location today, if, let's say, God forbid, your car gets stricken by lightning, you can come up with a story that you've been a bad boy, and Zeus is punishing you as a sinner by with a thunderbolt over your car. Hopefully nothing worse, right? But that's the proclivity of us as a species to interpret the natural world around us and the things that we observe in the form of a story with a cause-effect kind of a narrative, right? So even when there isn't a story, we make one.
Yes, I'd agree. But on the other hand, I think that I was arguing with John Gottschall, who's a friend of mine who has written books on story. He interpreted. He thought that the Hyder and Simmel film was simply a movement of objects about a space without any design. But if that had been the case, nobody would be able to make a story out of it. It's constructed in such a way that people can infer, and that's quite explicit by the psychologists behind it. So that's why I see it as a story. If you had random shapes moving about a screen with no sound for a minute and 40 seconds, people would not be able to infer a story. They can infer a story because there are clear kinds of movements in relationship to one another, proximity and distancing and spinning around and approaching the bigger one, approaching the smaller triangle, and so on, that we can't help inferring as the creators of the film intended as human relationships. And I think certainly we overread agency, and I think that's crucial to the whole importance of story, I think, and things like Zeus. things like religion. We overread agency terribly, but on the other hand, it pays for us to overread agency rather than to underread it. So.
Absolutely. So for example, one example that you give in your book is that it pays for us to see the twig in the bush as a snake rather than the snake as a twig, because evolutionarily speaking, those who saw the snake as a twig didn't make it. So, and those who did see the twig as a snake and run away did make it. So it definitely pays off. But let's go back on topic then. So what are the evolutionary origins of story?
Okay. Well, I think first they start with our being very, very social animals, very, very interested in monitoring one another, understanding what others in our group are doing. And we can see that, of course, in other primates like chimpanzees are very attentive to what the social dynamics. So that's the key factor. I think our ultra-sociality, if you like, our need to understand what others are doing and to be able to infer what they might do next, and to think, if I react in such and such a way, what will the consequences of that be from this individual, or in given this group dynamic within the group. There's that. I go through the process of talking about event comprehension as a forerunner to story. So the way our minds, and not just human minds, but other reasonably intelligent animals can parse things into objects, into sequences of action, and so on. So I build up the picture of event comprehension before going into the story, the account of event transmission, if you like. It seems likely that humans were communicating fairly intensely from perhaps about 500,000 years ago. We don't know when language began, but by that time by 400,000 years ago anyway, there's evidence of fairly large-scale collaborative hunting, which must have involved planning and strategizing. And this could have been through gesture, and there's a lot to suggest that the origin of spoken language was gesture, that we first began to use gesture before we added sound. And there's a suggestion that mimesis, what Stephen Mython calls mimesis, in other words, imitating actions, was a way of communicating information early on before we had language. And the evidence seems to suggest that, chimps, of course, are kind of notoriously but rather loosely described as imitators, but there are clear cases of chimps imitating another individual, say a chimp individual who has a limp, and playfully behind this chimp's back, imitating it for the sake of the amusement of one another. In the human case, it seems likely that we were able to imitate simple actions and enable others to understand the kind of actions we were calling up through these gestures. And probably we were doing this several 100,000 years ago. When language emerged, I think it would immediately have made the capacity to tell simple stories. And of course, I expect that there would have been a whole series of gradually sophisticated, more and more sophisticated proto-languages before there was full language. So it might have been limited. You couldn't tell a story like the Iliad or the Odyssey, even though it was a long time ago for us. Another few 100,000 years back, there would have been very, very simple stories. But but I expect that one of the earliest impulses for story was simply communicating information, that I saw a prey a prey beast in such and such an area. We could go there, or perhaps some social information about what somebody did to somebody else. So this kind of gossip or information about the near present would have become established before, I think, we got into fiction. But on the other hand, play exists in species, all mammals that have been investigated, and reptiles, in some invertebrates, and play is certainly deeply ingrained in humans. And once you have the capacity to tell true stories, then that can easily mix with play into children playing at activities and making up, enacting a situation for themselves, and adults telling more elaborate fictions.
So, would we say that our best guess is that the first kind of stories came alongside language? Or would we say that stories actually precede language and precede our ability to tell narrative, perhaps even by miming and by gesture?
I would think the latter. I wouldn't have at one stage, but there are examples like a group of Nicaraguan deaf mutes who have no language, and they don't have sign language either, but they mime stories to one another. And I think that's a very, very telling example. It suggests that, yes, before we had language, we had an impulse to tell story. I mean, they presumably, I don't know how much they're able to understand of stories on screens, say, but maybe they've been primed in a way that our ancestors would not have been to be interested in stories. But I think that our compulsion to observe one another and to try to infer motives and intentions and consequences are so deeply ingrained that stories would have been used as soon as any possible means could have been found, and that was even before language.
Yeah, I to be honest, am not quite convinced by that argument, because for a number of reasons, but I also read a fantastic paper of yours that you so kindly sent to me, and you finished, and by the way, let me just give the title here. The paper is called "The Evolution of Stories from Mimesis to Language, from Fact to Fiction." Fantastic paper. I highly recommend it. Is it publicly available so that I can link to it?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll link to it from our show notes. But one thing that you finish with in that paper, you say, quote, "First we invented stories, then they changed us." You see, I find that very convincing, because first we invent the tools, but then the tools, so first we create the tools, but then the tools create us. And so, for example, going back to that case of Nicaraguan deaf mutes, perhaps one way to explain that is that it's been now hundreds of thousands of years since our species has been using and therefore shaped by story and by our proclivity for story. And so after, so many thousands of generations, even individuals who may be deaf and mute are still exhibiting proclivity to create those stories, even when they lack language, simply because that's how we evolved by that point. But rewinding the tape 400,000 or 500,000 years back, I'm not sure that those individuals had that kind of proclivity. In other words, what I'm saying is, I'm not sure if that proclivity for us to tell story did not develop for the last 400,000 or 500,000 years, which would explain the behavior of those people. And perhaps our ancestors 400,000 or 500,000 years ago lacked it, and therefore they couldn't do that without the narrative and without the language. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, but I think given that chimpanzees, say, are so interested in what goes on in their group, that one chimpanzee will draw the attention of others to something that's significant that is happening. And given the fact that chimps can imitate other chimps, I think it's very, very likely that in simple ways there would have been communication about things going on in the group that were out of sight to particular individuals, so that if one person had access to good social information that others didn't, they would try to communicate it. And I think that
I remember you had actually several very good examples of that in your book. One of them was about the chimp trying to warn the alpha male chimp that one of the females was actually mating with another chimp. So that other chimp was trying to get the attention of the alpha male and trying to say, "Hey man, come see what's happening here," right? So yes, that's a very good point. So we can actually observe that ability to tell stories, perhaps, or to communicate anyway, even before we had that kind of language.
Yes, it would have been very rudimentary. I mean, that's something that
Sure.
It depends on it happening in the present and in close proximity. And I think our first stories would have been of that kind. They wouldn't have gone far beyond the here and now, and they would have probably involved very recognizable individuals within the group, and it would only become or very stereotyped actions, I suppose. It would only have become gradually possible to elaborate in ways beyond the here and now, beyond the members of the group, and to invent freely. But on the other hand, play does involve imitations of serious mode actions, and so I think children would have been, as children played doctors and nurses, or in my day used to play cowboys and Indians, these very stereotyped roles of opposition or cooperation, and they can elaborate them freely because the templates are so accessible to all. So I think storytelling would have, just like language, I think language may have been refined by the younger generation, by children, as well as by adults pushing different kinds of boundaries further. And so, yes, stories would have changed us at both the child level and the adult level.
So are we then the only species, or are we not the only species, in your view, that have that kind of proclivity to tell simple stories? We had the example of the chimps. Are there any other cases?
Well, the only other clear case is bees, if you like, honeybees, who dance and waggle in a way that says basically, I flew to a nectar source at a certain angle from the sun, and that inspires other bees to go out and forage in the same area. But again, that's very tied to the present and very stereotyped and very limited. There's no flexibility there. So that's, I was just on a respondent to Bob Fagan, who's a leading expert on animal play, talking at Harvard last week, and he sent me an email where he claimed that he'd heard ravens talking to one another in a story-like fashion, but it was certainly how he read the scene. I think, if you experimented, you would find that you didn't have any data, I'm sure. But I suppose we don't understand the language or the sound, the communications of whales and parrots and other very vocal.
Our pets sometimes tell us stories, perhaps our dogs, perhaps.
they certainly show emotions that that indicate what may have happened to them recently. But yes, so we would have to do a lot of inferring, I think. I suppose, yes, it'd be interesting to know how much another dog, how much better another dog could infer the story that a dog is conveying through expression than we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I do like to fantasize about a dog dog story, since their noses are so much more sophisticated than ours. Could they have a kind of if they could produce smells as well as register them? Could they tell a kind of smello story?
Where do art and fiction fit within that kind of a evolutionary framework within which you examine story?
Okay, yes, I do spend a lot of time on the origin of stories, talking about art in general before I get on to fiction in particular. And that's because at that stage I thought that it likely that our proclivity for art preceded our proclivity for story. That there's evidence of the likelihood of some simple forms of music, of chanting and rhythmic dancing or clapping in chimpanzees and in gibbons. There's quite complex duetting amongst pairs. So it's very likely that humans would have been involved in simple production of sounds that we could see as precursors to music, and also in terms of marking objects. The use of ochre for body painting and so on seems to go back perhaps a couple of 100,000, maybe 300,000 years, and things like scarification. So these are very, very early examples of art, and I had thought that it was likely that this tendency, this fascination with art might have arisen before we even had language. Now I tend to think that proto-language probably began at least as early as these early signs of art. But to talk about my description of art and the way it relates to story, I see art as a kind of cognitive or social play with pattern. Pattern is something that we need to be able to process quickly in order to understand the world around us. As a lot of neuroscientists will tell you, brains are fundamentally pattern interpreters, and they can interpret patterns at all kinds of levels. Because humans are our main advantages are not physical, they're in terms of interpreting information. We have a fascination with pattern that's much more intense than any other species. And we play with pattern. So we play with the patterns of colors, play with the patterns of sounds, and we also, in storytelling, play with the patterns of social information, if you like. And so that's a key, I think, to if you want to see fiction as an art, rather than focus on non-fictional narrative, then I think it does tie in very, very closely with the importance of play with pattern in music and in the various kinds of visual arts.
But I think it goes beyond pattern, though, doesn't it? And that's where story comes in, because computers are very good pattern recognizers themselves. But the problem that computers have is they're unable to ascribe meaning to the pattern. And that's one of the problems for that is that so-called AI framing problem. Because AI lacks the frame that humans are born with, that we are wired for. they can see the patterns, but they cannot necessarily ascribe a meaning to the pattern. So, for example, we can see a pattern of an event. Let's say there's a lightning hitting the grass near me in the savannah, and the fire is moving towards me. Now, that's the pattern that's evolving. I'm recognizing the pattern, but the meaning of that pattern is run. Run away as fast as possible if you want to survive, right? That's the meaning. That's the information processing part, right? So you have the information of a lightning hit not far away from me. You have the information there's a fire. And now, okay, what does that mean? It means that in 5 minutes, I'll be on fire if I don't run away from here, right? And this is where AI is stumbling. And this is what makes our story so useful and perhaps such a powerful adaptive evolutionary trait that you say that it is, that I believe that it is.
Yes, we interpret patterns hierarchically, all at ever more and more complex levels, up to understanding events, if you like, and in ways that are, as you say, biologically related to our situation. They can't help be, whereas AI is just looking at it can't ascribe meaning to any pattern. So, yeah, everything we see, we can we automatically relate to our interests and needs. We can't help doing so. And stories, whatever kinds of patterns they have patterns of character, different kinds of people interacting, different kinds of situations, different kinds of intentions, outcomes. We process that almost effortlessly. We construe, as in the Hyder and Zimmel film, that we see proximity as signs of relationship, and we read intent into just the distance that people are keeping from one another, or the approach to one another, the fleeing. We process things very, very efficiently to understand things in terms of the social information that's relevant to us.
And that's because we are wired to do so. We are evolved to do so. And in other words, we are evolved to not only recognize patterns, but to ignore ones which are not relevant to our direct survival immediately, right?
Well, they barely come to consciousness. Yeah.
Right. And the problem with AI is that it doesn't have this kind of a evolutionary luggage, if you will, or framework, perhaps is a better word. Framework which tells it, ignore this information, ignore this data, and focus on this data only to make this kind of a conclusion. And because they lack that, and we haven't figured out a way to create it yet for them, or to design it, they are literally could be drowning in data and be unable to ascribe meaning to it, which is the AI frame problem that you talk about in your book. Now, let me talk a little bit about something else too, which story is very good at, and that's ascribing primary and secondary causes to events. So, for example, the primary cause of the fire in the savannah that I was describing could be a lightning. So I see the lightning hit the dry grass, and I see the smoke in the fire, and then I can ascribe a sequence of a cause and effect. So the cause is the lightning, the effect is a fire. So for the beginning, that's good enough. But then eventually, once I run away from that dangerous situation and I sit somewhere under a tree and eat my bananas, I have lots of time to think and to process. And then I can start thinking, but why did that lightning hit that particular spot of the savannah which was so close to me? And then I start unfolding and coming up with another overarching story about the bigger why, not the primary why as per the lightning, but why lightning, why here, and why me? Does that say anything about who I am and what I'm doing, right or wrong, right? And this is where, again, I want to connect it a little bit perhaps with my original definition, information processing, right? It is all about the processing because we can't help it. We always tend to ascribe a meaning of, oh, this is good or this is bad. Maybe Zeus is punishing me for my evil deeds. That's why he's throwing lightnings everywhere I go.
Yes, exactly. I think as soon as we were capable of story, we were looking for deeper explanations, and because our minds are so wired for social information, we understand, and because we know that that unseen things like our thoughts can affect others, and if we can read the intentions of somebody on another face and react accordingly without actually having been touched. There's this tendency to understand anything that is not immediately clear at what seems like a deeper level, in terms of some unseen agent willing something. And that's where religion comes in, and I think makes a huge impact on the power of story through most of the early development of story, so that there's been no human group being found without a religion, and there's I think, what is it, 100,000 different religions they estimate to have arisen. Yeah, it's just very, very difficult for us not to understand things in those story-like terms, to see unseen agents, to overread agency, to assume that if we have an explanation in terms of some special being who has powers that beyond the ordinary, then we've got an explanation, and people seem very satisfied with that because we are such social creatures. We understand things in social terms. If you've got that deeper explanation, then you don't need to go further, and that's why it's taken science such a long time to emerge, because it means denying those natural inclinations to explain things in social terms, and you have to really challenge your whole way of thinking in order to come up with explanations that have no spiritual or no unseen agents causing anything. That's why the story of evolution was so difficult for many to accept. It was a lot easier to understand God creating the world than to think of a lot of random events happening in succession.
And evolution, evolution is a story, of course, but religion is perhaps one of the most powerful stories preceding the story of evolution, perhaps the most powerful story for hundreds of thousands of years, or if not hundreds, maybe at least tens of thousands of years preceding the story of evolution. The most powerful story was religion. It's a story that tells us who we are, where we're coming from, where we're going, how we should be living our life, what is right, what is wrong. It's giving us basically the whole textbook, right? We don't need to think or worry about anything. It's like a manual for living wrapped up in a story that's easy to remember, to associate with, and it tells you even what the rewards are if you're playing that story right, and what the punishment is if you're not.
That's right, and these stories can be incredibly empowering in a way. I think of the Australian Aboriginals telling these Dreamtime stories about the formation of the land, the local land, and the resources there that are just opaque to non-Aboriginals inhabiting who come into that territory, and because these stories are so important for their survival. They have very elaborate rituals and very complex initiation ceremonies, beating these stories, if you like, into individuals, so they will not be short of that information when they find themselves alone out in the wilderness.
And I think in one place in your book, you give the example that grooming is the glue that keeps ape communities or ape societies together. So let me ask you this. Is story in general, and perhaps for a very, very long time, the religious story in particular, the story that kept the human society together, that acted as the glue for our human civilization?
Yes, I think there's very strong evidence of that. Especially if you bring in the theory of multi-level selection, that at different a more cohesive group can outcompete a less cohesive group, and a more cohesive group that may well be created by having a story that unites them in terms of religion and values, belief in a particular set of gods. If they have that, they may be able to expand. I think non-religious stories too have the same function. That the vast majority of stories are pro-social. They will punish people who cross the local ethical standards, or often are very, very universal standards, so that the same story, a Jane Austen story will matter to people in Thailand or Brazil. It'll be legible enough, and the moral implications will be clear enough. I think all sorts of stories are ways of communicating to a group the values that they share, the kinds of costs that somebody's going to bear if they transgress those values. And because the stories are naturally arresting, because they often have, in fictional stories anyway, you can have heroes that are larger than life, actions that are more extreme than everyday routines. The stakes are high. People will attend, and they will know that others are attending in the group. Of course, all stories would have been shared at one point in the group around the campfire. People will know that other people are imbibing these same values, and that solves the problem of common knowledge. I need to know that you know these values, and so I can trust you to act on them. So in that sense, yes, stories are a very powerful glue.
Mm-hmm. And then let's see, if story is adaptive, as you claim in your book, let us try to break it down even a little further, how it works. And I think in your book you give the kind of the following framework. You say that the biological explanation of behavior must answer 4 questions. First is the why, which is usually pertaining to fitness. What is the ultimate function? Second is the how, which is the mechanism. How does it operate? What stimuli cause it to occur? Third is whence, or that's the phylogeny, that is to say, what are the evolutionary predecessors? What did it evolve from? And then finally, when, or the ontogeny, which is to say, when does the adaptation develop and change in the individual? So can you walk us through those and see if we can sort of give our best guesses to those? So I think we already started with okay, let's start with the why, because we covered some of them sort of, but let's lay them out a little more specifically. Why?
Well, the why is especially, I think, in terms of giving us good social information, so that we and social information in a highly memorable form, so that and of course we learn a great deal from simply observing others, but that's limited to what a particular individual happens to observe. Whereas stories are concocted in order to maximize attention, in order to dramatize particularly intense situations where big things are at stake, and they also will be enlivened by a range of dramatically interesting characters. So we will learn about the range of human psychology, the kinds of consequences of particular kinds of actions, the moral, emotional effect on us of people transgressing particular values. We will learn a great deal more through story about how the range of human possibilities, the range of ways of acting, and the consequences, and how to read those actions through story. So it's basically a kind of massive lesson in social cognition in a way that we find particularly appealing and actually irresistible.
And that's why I gave you the definition that I gave you with the stress on processing. And that's why, and I'm very happy to hear that Jonathan Gotcho agrees with me that the triangular circle story is not really a story in our world, because it doesn't have those elements in it, but we're tricked to fabricate them while they're not even present there at all. But
there are elements there. There's bullying, antagonism, a couple sharing goals to escape from the bully, and the sense that the bully is unable to control his emotion. He smashes his own house at the end.
But that's the interpretation. That's not in the story itself, isn't it?
It's not explicit, but then we always infer massively beyond the evidence. Sure. And this is just an example. It's what the psychologists were trying to show. But they have supplied enough information so that we inferred in particular kind of ways.
Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. And I'm happy that Jonathan Gotcho is on my side, because
he came around when I pointed out that
Okay, he came around. Well, maybe I can come around too. We have lots to talk here. So let's talk about the second part though. So we covered the why, which is the fitness and the function. Now let's talk about the how, the mechanism. How does it work? What stimuli cause it to occur?
Yes. This is where I talked about event comprehension and about the inbuilt understanding of the physics of the world, the objects in the world, and the social cognition that we have that it enables us to infer emotions from expressions and intentions from actions and so on. So it's building on the kinds of understanding of the world that other mammals will have about objects and actions, but especially on our unique sensitivity to human actions, the very sophisticated social cognition we have, which I think is amplified as some people have pointed out even by non-fiction story. In non-fiction story, in gossip, report, and so on, we get all sorts of information about other actions that we didn't happen to observe directly. So our capacity for social cognition, the examples that we have to work with to understand how things work in the social world, are amplified incredibly by story. And so story not only depends on our social cognition, but it feeds our social cognition. So
and the way I have interpreted this is by saying that the most important feature of our civilization, perhaps its greatest invention, is not the internet, it's not the wheel, it's not certainly cryptocurrencies, it's story. Because there have been many civilizations without the wheel, without cryptocurrencies, without the internet, but none has ever existed without story. Because just like we gave the example that grooming is the social glue that puts together and keeps together the ape society, story is the social glue that keeps together the human society and is the foundation for any larger scale one to become a civilization.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the most important invention. I'd say the language is probably the most important, but it's an absolutely indispensable one for us to go beyond. It certainly has made us what we are.
Well, but if you were saying in your book that story precedes language, and now you said that you changed your mind most recently on that, but my reasoning was that if it's true to say that story, based on the example of the deaf mutes from Nicaragua or Mexico, that story kind of precedes language, then it would seem that it's the first invention, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that story would have been very, very limited without language. So,
Sure, language, yeah,
it would be
enriches it.
limited in the way the honeybees dance is
Yes,
limited without language.
yes,
So, yeah.
absolutely.
The two interacted and exploded to make us what we are, I think, yeah.
Right, and that's why I was trying to stress in my kind of counter argument to that was an exploration of the feedback loop between story on the one hand, language on the other hand, and biology on the third hand, because they're all kind of connected. Our story influences our language, and it influences our biology, which influences our language, which influences our story, and then it's like a feedback loop. So it's really hard to separate one from the other. They're all so fundamental.
Yeah.
And
which is one reason why it's so hard to really pin down an evolutionary explanation, because there are these feedback loops going way back in time, and you don't know what rudiment of which of these factors developed first, and they would all have been rudimentary and interacting in positive feedbacks from a very humble beginning.
Absolutely, and that's why our answers to some of those questions, like for example, the third question is whence, which is to say, what are the evolutionary predecessors? When did it evolve? What did it evolve from? Are basically our best guess, as you said in the beginning, 400 or 500,000 years ago, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and if we had proto-language, a succession of proto-languages, I presume we also had a succession of proto-stories, so that we arrive at amazingly sophisticated stories in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in Homer, but these would be absolutely unthinkable without writing, I think, and certainly Homer was an oral poet, but he used the mnemonics of verse in order to be able to remember 24,000 lines of story that he'd created. And possibly, I suppose, bards could have been telling elaborate stories if the social situation allowed story specialists even further back. But you can imagine that, say, if we could time travel back to 100,000 years ago, I would be surprised if they weren't telling stories. But the stories would have been fairly simple, I expect, and perhaps the most elaborate stories would have been religious ones, in order to explain things and to produce the social glue of the group.
Right. So, what's your best guess that we have, like, about the arrival of the story of religion as a major story, fundamental framework with which we kind of look at the world? So we have Hesiod, and the Greek myths and legends, which are kind of like setting up the whole framework about how the cosmos works, the universe works, and not only how it works today, but also about its origin, about its metaphysics, how it came to be, how it was born. So when do you think is your best guess we got kind of the arrival of that story?
I would be hard put to put a figure on it, but I mean, the Aboriginal stories, say in Australia, they were isolated for 60,000 years or so, and clearly their stories might have elaborated enormously between the time of their arrival in Australia and their first contact with Europeans. But they have very, very complex creation stories and animistic interpretations of their environment and of all sorts of causal factors in the creation of the world, the creation of the local area. And I suspect those kinds of things would have been the case 100,000 years ago. I'm not sure. They would have been further elaborated, and of course it seems to have taken a long time to get to a monotheistic explanation that seems to have emerged only about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago.
So the reason why I've been pushing that line is the following, though, because to use another definition of what story is, I'll bring Kenneth Burke's definition of story, and he says that story is an equipment for living. And I think the best representation of his claim is religion, because the religious story is the equipment, is the framework, which, as I said, tells us who we are, where we're coming from, where we're going, what happens to us when we die, what's right, what's wrong, who we should be married to, what we should eat, what we should not eat, what's right, what's wrong, how we should worship the gods. Everything is spelled out for us, right? So it's an equipment for living. Now, the problem is, though, and you kind of feel free to critique and agree or disagree with me, the problem is that I think that our equipment for living is now going obsolete. It is falling apart. In other words, there is the divide between the real world around us as we can observe and see it and experience it is growing further and further apart from the stories that we use as frameworks, as equipment for living, that tells us what the world is all about, who we are in this world, what's right, what's wrong, and where we're going towards. And so to give you a better way of capturing that, I want to bring a quote from, let's see, where is he? A quote from Jonas Sachs. And Jonas Sachs calls this the myth gap. And a myth gap, in his words, his quote, and he has a fantastic book called, what is his book called? The Future Wars. No, the Coming Story Wars. Apologies. The Coming Story Wars. Fantastic book. And on page 58, he says that the myth gap is, quote, the space between the realities of our current moment in history and the shared stories to which we turn for explanation, meaning, and instruction for action. And so we have this myth gap, this kind of divide that's growing and growing. Our old stories are becoming less and less capable to explain what's happening around us, to connect to our life, to give us guidance of how to frame and address and what's the proper action to take towards resolving our problems. And so when you have this kind of a situation, when the stories start falling apart, you have chaos. And you may even have civilization collapse in some cases.
Well, I think in many ways science and science and philosophy, science in the broadest sense, not only the natural sciences, but any kind of serious attempt to understand the world is in many ways supplementing stories so that we can negotiate values now without invoking gods, and clearly it's fraught because we don't have the kind of guarantees that God provides. We have to explore things and admit our our very partial knowledge of, and understanding of everything, it is certainly more difficult without a Bible or a canonical set of myths to explain everything for you when you have to work things out. But I don't feel that we're thrust into chaos quite yet.
But I think science doesn't work in that way, though, because science is a tool. It's a means to an end.
It can be, but it can also be a means of understanding that is not instrumental, not merely instrumental.
But how can it be? Because it doesn't. It needs an outside framework within which it can assess things. So, for example, Pulitzer Prize-winning Toni Morrison noted once that, quote, "Facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot." Albert Einstein himself once said that there are no facts without theory. And what's a theory? A theory is a story. So there are no facts without theory. You need to have a theory first so that you have a fact. And finally, whether we call it truth or theory, we need a story to put those facts into a context, into a framework that I was talking about, that religion used to give us, within which we can assess everything. And that helps us being able to see them in perspective, to rank and organize those facts, to prioritize them in order of importance, to give them a kind of a value of hierarchy. We cannot organize facts by mere facts. We need to have a framework within which those facts are being evaluated in a priority order or hierarchy of importance, and to make sense therefore of and to assign value to them. And so it would seem to me that science without story really has no agenda, no priorities, no meaning, no direction, no value, and no use, because that's how science works. You go into exploring a problem because you believe it's important or valuable. So you start with that.
That's right. I mean, science incorporates values. It incorporates the values of truth. It incorporates the values of criticism, of listening to others, of subjecting your ideas to testing, and so on. It's very highly social, and it embodies social values in some ways in the best form we have. I don't think of science as being somehow sterilely removed from what is human. It's deeply human, and it involves the imagination. It involves the imagination to come up with a hypothesis, to test a hypothesis, and it involves human cooperation and competition in very fertile ways. So I think it's a scary situation for some, which is why they want to revert to a fundamentalist religion or an ethno-nationalism or something like that. But I think it does require a sense of nerve to be able to face the world as it is and still insist that the human values that science can explain and that science incorporates are essential to us. So, say, to take the example of climate change, it's something that the gods are not equipped to explain, I don't think.
Yeah, but neither does science, because science can tell us the facts about climate change. It can tell us without any doubt whatsoever that the climate is warming. It can tell us without any doubt whatsoever that we are the cause of it, right? It cannot tell us what to do about it. So you have people who tell us, great, our values are the economy and jobs, right? Not that I agree with that, but they say, so you have people who say, look, we are the cause of the climate. It's the greatest challenge that humanity is facing. Therefore, we should change our actions so that we can minimize our impact on the climate and try to limit the damage as much as possible. That's one value-derived proposed course of action. Another course of action, which is equally value-derived, is saying, no, our priority is not the climate, and it's not keeping the temperature to 1.5 degrees, but jobs and the economy. And that's our values. And therefore, we can agree on the facts, but disagree on the action.
But that's the same whether you've got religion or not. I mean, if you look at religious sects, religious wars in the past, you get different religions offering different values, different codes of conduct, and fierce contestation that's led to the 30 Years' War in Europe and so on, or long brutal schisms and.
The Crusades were for a couple hundred years. Yeah. And another example that comes to my mind is perhaps the epitome of science of its day, surely, at Trinity, when Oppenheimer was facing the first nuclear explosion on the planet, science was useless to help him frame and explain and communicate the phenomenon that had just occurred for the first time at Trinity. So what did he do? He said, I am become death, the creator and destroyer of worlds. So he went way before science to the Bhagavad Gita, to a story, so that he can give a proper framework to the most advanced science of the day. And many of his colleagues, by the way, who were the founders of quantum mechanics, they were big readers and fans of the Bhagavad Gita, and got lots of inspiration from the stories there that they kind of twisted and changed and tweaked to make useful in the science that they were doing. So in other words, you cannot get an ought from an is. The science can give you the is, but the ought cannot come from it, or so it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree. But on the other hand, it need not come only from religion.
But it needs to come from a story. That's what I'm trying to say. So it need not come from religion, but it comes always from some story. So let's say the Green Revolution. The story is we're running out of food in the 60s. We're running out of space. The arable land that we have today is not producing proportionally enough food that is going to keep up with the proportional growth of human population. Therefore, we're going to be facing a crisis. Therefore, we need to invent a new technology or new ways of producing more from the same amount of land and water that we've had before. And, we invented nitrogen fertilizers, what is it called? The Boch, forgive me, the German guy who also invented mustard gas. And he also was the co-inventor of the Boch method of creating nitrogen or ammonia from air, which then was converted into nitrogen fertilizer, and which eventually led to the Green Revolution, right? But the motivation is coming from the story. The prioritization of that action, the impetus, even if you want to call it this way, the agency came from the story, didn't it?
I don't think so. I think it comes from human values, which are related to human problems and human values, which underlie story but aren't dependent on story. They're certainly.
Fritz Haber was his name, by the way. Just occurred to me. Fritz Haber was the guy's name, and the process is called the Haber-Boch process.
But it seems to me that human needs and values precede story. They are incorporated into story. They're amplified and refined by story. But I don't think we can say that story is at the beginning of everything. That we wouldn't have value, wouldn't have problems, and wouldn't have values without story. Yeah.
Okay, so how do we explain then the present situation that very unfortunately some people found themselves in? And that's a direct quote that I just got from the news a couple of days ago. Quote, I, I am being bombed every day, and my mom in Moscow tells me that I'm mistaken.
So yeah, well, there is clearly a false story being generated by Putin. And stories are very, very powerful. I don't deny that. But on the other hand, the story of the resistance of Ukraine, their heroism in withstanding the bullies next door, are also inspiring people. Stories, if you manage to suppress any alternative stories, as Putin has done, it can be very, very powerful, unfortunately.
I mean, aren't stories the most powerful thing of our civilization? And that's going back to our previous kind of discussion about whether it's language or whether it's story. My reading is that it's story because stories make us kill and die for. And stories make us, even in this case, like for example, that I just gave, overrule or override the biological genetic connections between a mother and a daughter. And the mother who lives in Moscow and is watching the Russian state TV propaganda refuses to believe her own daughter, who is in the Ukraine, being bombed and scared for her life. And there were so many cases like that. Another guy who was arguing with his dad, who is a priest in a monastery somewhere near Moscow, and his dad is also telling him, this is not true, you're being mistaken, the Russian soldiers are coming to liberate you.
Yeah, well, that's one of the dark sides of story, in fact, that it can be used for propaganda. And we have tended to focus on the benefits of a story, but yes, it can have very, very sinister sides. The kind of I don't think it's either story or language. Putin is using language like scum to describe people in the West, and the in Rwanda, or in Hitler's Germany, the use of vermin and cockroach and so on to describe people of a particular race. Just language itself, as well as story, can be used for the purposes of hate. I mean, any kind of tool can be used for positive or negative ends.
That's what your friend and your colleague Jonathan Gocho talks about in the storytelling paradox, how our love of storytelling builds societies and tears them down, right? So he warns us there, quote, story science reveals that everything good about story is the same as everything bad. So to get good people to behave monstrously, you must first tell them a story. So the real question for Jonathan is, how can we save the world from stories? So it would appear to me that he agrees with me that story is among, if not the most powerful thing on the planet, because we kill and die for it.
Yes, but on the other hand, the impulse to belong to your group, to serve the causes of your group, I think precede story. They're amplified by story, and they can be perverted by propagandistic stories. But I'm just reluctant to make story the kind of universal explanation for where we are.
That's very good. That's very good, because it gives me a very useful point of criticism towards my own work right now. Because perhaps if you were to qualify or capture where my current thinking is like story is the framework that explains most things in our civilization right now. It makes sense of everything, and there's pros to that, but there's obviously cons.
And I mean, you weren't quite saying this, but we can't really explain things without story. I mean, even there's a scholar called Robert Root Bernstein, I think, who talks about the way chemists say imagine themselves as little particles and combining, and we have to create a story when we have an explanation. I mean, physics is so remote at one level from human experience, but physics tells us the story of the Big Bang and of the future of the cosmos, and we can't help seeing things in story form. It's
Muriel Rukeyser says that the universe is made of stories, not atoms.
Well, I would say that stories are already patterns. So
yeah, and so that's very interesting, though. So, and that's why the framework that I was trying to push. So, do you not accept or agree with that kind of a myth gap that Jonathan Gotcho was talking about? Because my argument, which I came up kind of independently, but then he defined it so well that I'm kind of borrowing his name, the myth gap, is a very good way to assess the current civilizational problems that we have currently today, which is why we're facing problems where, for example, like climate change, we have the science, we're very clear on how the mechanisms work, we're very clear of the consequences of our action, we're very clear on the consequences of our inaction, and yet we fail to mobilize sufficiently enough to take action. And that's because there is no kind of a popular framework or story that has gained enough momentum to push us towards one action or another. You have a diversity of mutually inclusive, exclusive stories that fight.
Well, part of the problem is that, I mean, maybe you can see this as a story problem in itself, is that climate change, like evolution, it depends not on individual actions that we can dramatize, but on a whole series of small-scale actions that together amount to a pattern that is also long-term. We tend to focus on the immediate future, and this is the long-term future. We've got many problems to deal with in the immediate future. I think it's partly that we're not wired to understand the world in terms of long-term consequences, and things, of course, get more and more unpredictable the longer term we're thinking of. So I think I don't think it's just a problem with story. I think it's a problem with the fact that our situation, minute by minute, is complex, has so many competing interests right now. These are things that we should all share together, but we've never the effort to combat climate change. But there are competing interests all around. They have some will try to tell you stories, like the fossil fuel industry will try to tell you stories that in fact we need to continue to produce oil in the short term, or there'll be jobs. But I wouldn't say it's simply a question of not having the right stories. It's that there are too many conflicting interests, too many ways in which this particular crisis doesn't fit our natural capacity for dealing with things in the relatively short term. And of course our politics too, our election cycles and so on, are geared towards the short term. So
but that's why I'm saying that our current story, which again, as Karen Burke pointed out, is stories as an equipment for living, fails to connect to and frame properly our current predicaments in a way that's conducive to their proper resolution. So, for example, the election cycles, that's a type of a story which is entirely arbitrary, whether it should be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 50 years. It's arbitrary to a great degree. And again, if you have a popular story, that takes off, you would have this kind of a galvanization momentum behind it, just like religions, because any kind of idea, whether it's communism, capitalism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, is a kind of a story that took off, that gained massive momentum, right? Islam didn't exist. Muhammad came along, and in a couple of 100 years, you had the Ummah, which was the greatest empire in the world at that time, spanning from southern Spain and northern Africa all the way to Indonesia, right? That's the power of a story. And that story told people who they are, where they're coming from, where they're going, what happens to them after they die fighting for the cause, etc., etc. But it created a viral effect of the story, which, made it spread. And the reason why climate change, I say, hasn't worked is because clearly it's not viral enough yet.
On the other hand, there are many apocalyptic stories being told, and this is one way of trying to deal with the uncertainties of the future. But none of them are. There are so many competing stories out there. That's one of the problems, that it would be very hard for one story to get traction and to get buy-in from the whole planet.
Maybe not the whole planet, but sufficiently large number of people. So, for example, you have the story of Me Too movement. You have the story of human rights. Human rights didn't exist until probably the 18th century. There's a theory, and you probably are a lot more familiar with it than me, that it was an invention of the English novels of the 17th and 18th century. It's a literary invention that eventually migrated into the social and political realm from the literally fiction realm. And so, but that idea, that story about human rights, and actually there's even another idea even before that actually that idea about human rights was taken by the first kind of North American settlers from the indigenous peoples of North America, who had a lot more developed ideas about kind of decentralized society and therefore individual rights, and how it wasn't necessarily might makes right like it used to be in Europe, but rather it was a public discourse and public debate in which a tribal leader was kind of elected on a sort of a temporary kind of a basis, and alliances were formed based on their kind of oratory skill, if you will, and they had a lot more established ideas about sort of individual rights, which were then picked up by the first settlers, and then through the empire of letters sent over to Europe, and those kind of were the seeds behind the Enlightenment and so on. And correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here, and that's kind of a hypothesis, I guess, but
that's a story.
Sure, it's a story, yeah. And but regardless of where, the point I'm trying to make is that it didn't exist for most of human history, and then it suddenly sprang into existence, and now it's the established norm. Why? Because it's such a powerful story. So now 200 countries accept, or most of them accept the idea, at least in theory, of human rights. Right? And we have many such examples of movements that start with one person, like the Me Too movement, one legal case, and then it suddenly becomes global. A bunch of truck drivers try to drive downtown Ottawa, and then suddenly you have copycats in Washington or in a bunch of other places, because that's the power of story. And so what I'm saying is that if the story is powerful enough, whether you call it Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, it's going to take off like fire and get sufficiently enough part of the population, not necessarily everybody, but it will be viral enough to make a change.
It would be certainly to be welcomed if we did have a galvanizing viral story about climate change that would bring effects. And I don't know, it may happen. I suspect that we'll still have a lot of conflicting stories that won't allow resolution very easily.
So is this a problem then of having too many stories?
I think that can be a problem. I think that the benefits of stories that we had when we were around the hunter-gatherer campfire are not the same benefit as having the absolute glut of stories that we have now, when there are vastly more stories than we can possibly expose ourselves to. And I do speculate that there's a problem that that spending so much time in stories leads to a kind of intellectual diabetes, where just as the availability of high sugar and fat foods leads to a diabetes epidemic. I think there could be something similar happening to the brains of those who gorge themselves on stories all the time. But I don't know that there's any way to deal with that. I mean, we can't censoring stories, reducing the number of stories we tell is not going to be an answer.
Yeah, I agree with you. On the other hand, we have had a lot of kind of a globalization of stories, of big stories coming in and subsuming all the other stories within them. For example, one such story is inevitably evolution. Right now, we're looking at everything through the framework of evolution, and the story of story even is evaluated and looked at in your book and through the framework of the theory of evolution. So, and in a way, you could say that the evolution is another story, isn't it?
Oh yes, yes. It's not the kind of story that we're naturally attuned to, because it doesn't have individual agents making decisive differences, and it depends on accumulation of very small effects over a very long period of time. So it's not, in one sense, it's not very story-like at all. On the other hand, it is, if you kind of speed up the camera and you roll through millions of years rather fast, it becomes a very animated story.
And isn't that kind of, in a way, you could say that it used to be the case that religion was the human story that told us who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going, etc., etc. And then, at least for those of us who are non-religious today, the theory of evolution would probably be the framework or the story of what it means to be human.
Yes, I think so. We also have the still larger story of cosmology, of course, which is
Sure.
within which evolution is embedded. The evolution of if you like, of the stars and the elements from stars explosions and so on.
And that's what I meant by saying that we're having now this kind of globalization process of story, which create overarching global stories that subsume or digest, if you will, swallow up the smaller stories. But going back to the human story, whether we're talking about the evolutionary, the Darwinian theory of evolution, or whether we're talking about the religious story, and whether the perception of those is correct, accurate, or inaccurate, I would propose to you that the current human story consists of four main parts. And you correct me if I'm wrong or if you disagree with me. Whether it's the theory of evolution or whether it's religion, the first part is the story of progress, of us kind of transcending our animalistic origins, of us kind of being in God's own image, therefore different. And in the religious story, the world was created to be our garden and therefore ours for the taking. And in the evolutionary story, we have that kind of transcendent movement of biological evolution, of intelligence, of being special, of being above kind of the other animals. We are those who can make tools, who can speak, who can tell stories, who can look into the future, etc., etc. So that's first part, I would say, the story of progress. And the second part is the story of the supremacy and the centrality of humanity. Some people have said, whether Darwin meant it or not, some people have said, look, we are the pinnacle of evolution, right? We are the most intelligent species on our planet right now. Therefore, we're special. There's no one like us. The old religious story would tell us we're special because we're the only ones who have a soul, because we're the only ones who are in the image of God. But it's the same story, what I'm trying to say here. Then the third part is of that human story is the story of our separation from nature. And the question here is, are we a part of the world or are we apart from the world? And unfortunately, the common sort of popular presumption is that we are apart, we are separate from the world. We are, different from the rest of nature, whether for divine reasons like us being in the image of God, or whether for the fact that we're the pinnacle of evolution and the smartest species on our planet. So we're special, we're different, we're not like the rest of them. A very kind of speciesist in its core. And then finally, we have the pinnacle of that idea, which is perhaps given in transhumanism, which is very evolutionary and Darwinian in a way, and epitomized by quotes or little quips by people like Stuart Brand, who says that we are already as powerful as gods, so we might as well behave as such and embrace that fact that we are gods now. And so the final part of that human story that I propose of this general narrative is the story of us becoming gods. This is kind of what transhumanism is also kind of about, whether through biological immortality, through life extension technology, genetic engineering, or whether through mind uploading and or other forms of artificial intelligence. So how do you evaluate this kind of a story or narrative that I just gave you? Does that make sense at all?
Well, certainly the very idea of progress, which is so embedded in Western thinking these days, was something that was not natural at all to humans for many thousands of years. The idea was much more often a story of decay, that the origins, when we were closer to the gods, say, were much a golden age that we've declined from. We're living in an age of lead. And I think I think there's no doubt that we have made enormous progress in many things, but there's no reason to assume that will continue, and we have to keep fighting in order to ensure that the progress isn't whittled away by things like climate change or, God forbid, nuclear war or whatever. The idea of the centrality of humanity, I think that's been with us for a long time, that the gods, certainly in Christianity and the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, the God creating humans as very special in his own likeness, that has been there for a long time before the evolution came into it. So it's just a part of our natural arrogance, I think, that, and I imagine that any species is speciesist, that they understand their own species, they want to engage with their own species, and they don't really understand other species terribly well. The separation from nature, I don't think that, evolution in a way is a story about our deep embeddedness in nature, and even our moral values, our capacity to get beyond nature through science is also an evolutionary story, an evolutionary epistemological story, if you like. It's I think any kind of science will lead us back to the conclusion that we're a part of nature, and also that we are apart from nature in that we can understand, we can apply technology to transform nature. As for transhumanism, well, I am very uncertain about what the future holds if we manage to survive our current crises, but I think it'll be unimaginable, frankly. Any of the things you suggested could happen, but future forecasters tend to get it wrong. Nobody predicted that social media, smartphones, and so on would arise and shape so much of what we do in 15 or 20 years. And Lord knows what the next invention will be that will suddenly transform the way we engage with one another.
It's one of those things, though, that makes sense in retrospect, because in a way you could say social media is all about stories.
Yeah.
Right? It's about me trying to get in control of my own story that I kind of project in the world by creating this kind of fabricated profile with selected pictures, selected snippets of my life and who I am and what I'm for about, and kind of getting in charge or in control of our story while failing to recognize the self-defeating kind of nature of this whole attempt within the framework that we're trying to accomplish it. But it, in a way, in retrospect, it makes sense, in particular in the context of our conversation, because at its core is about controlling the story where we are the protagonists, we are the main heroes.
Yeah, it's a kind of story I don't want to get into, but yeah, for many people it is very seductive, and that you don't have to actually front up and engage with people in the real world in terms of the kindness of your actions. There, you can concoct a projection of yourself, spreading out over the entire world if people are ready to follow you.
And those were designed, by the way, to hack our brains by hackers very deliberately and intentionally, due to the sort of neurochemistry of how story works and how we get the dopamine hits and how we get hooked and dependent on more and more and more. So they were cleverly designed to exploit and imitate and feed within the story neurobiology that we have, that we're wired for.
Indeed, yeah.
Wow. So, Professor Boyd, can I keep you for another 10 or 15 minutes by any chance?
Okay.
Because I'm trying to see what's kind of the final direction that we can steer our conversation towards. And perhaps one attempt to make sense of it, or perhaps not, would be, should we bring Karl Popper in this and see where he fits in this conversation about story, or does he?
Yes, in some ways. So I'm writing a biography of Karl Popper, who's a philosopher of science and also a philosopher of politics, if you like, in the open society and its enemies. Popper was certainly, he was one of the founding evolutionary epistemologists, and he always stressed that science grew out of myth, that without myth there would not have been science, that science emerged when people began to, when one myth collided with another myth and people began to critique their myths. and developed a tradition of critique. So
when the old myths fall apart, we have a revolution, and new myths take over, new stories take over.
yeah. He was also somebody who was very, very skeptical about the idea that we could predict the future. So in the Open Society and Its Enemies, he talks about both Plato and Hegel, and after Hegel, Marx, trying to predict a future. For Plato was a future of decay that had to be arrested by holding things as well, by instituting the rule of the wisest, which was people like him.
Sure.
For Hegel and Marx, it was more an image of the future, and Marx felt that he could confidently predict that the increasing immiseration of the world under capitalism, and that therefore capitalism would collapse and socialism and Marxism, communism would be inevitable, and that story, of course, inspired many in the communist world, or the communist movements over the last nearly 2 centuries. And of course, the story that he projected was falsified, if you like to use another Popperian term, by the events of real life, where immiseration was not the consequence of increasing capitalism. Although we've got slack enough with capitalism these days that we're causing far more misery than it should.
Well, but that's kind of my point, and Karl Popper actually came in very well, I think, because I grew up behind the Iron Curtain in Bulgaria. I was 14 years old when it collapsed. And so in a way, you could say the 20th century was a clash of 3 stories. Was capitalism, fascism, and communism. Fascism was the first one that kind of was falsified, hopefully at the end of World War II, even though there's remnants all over the world still, but mostly marginal. Same happened with communism, you could say, after 1989 and the collapse of the the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and so on, the Soviet Union collapse. But then we had Francis Fukuyama, who rushed quickly to declare the end of history, because you see, capitalism is not only the best story we've ever told, but it was the best story that could ever be told. So from then on, it would be just more of the same story, tweaked a little bit here and there, but largely the same. So therefore, end of history, you see. But I say that the last 20 years, the first 20 years of the 21st century, have proven that the story of capitalism is falling apart. And therefore, we need to rewrite the human story once again. And just as you pointed out, science, the origins of science, as Popper said, is embedded in myth, or as I would say, story. And every time you had the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, you had one story replacing another story, right? And right now we're in this myth gap. Right now we're in this kind of a global vacuum where you don't have a dominant story. We have a bunch of stories clashing, but you don't have a sufficiently powerful story that gives us direction, that creates impetus for collective action at a sufficiently large enough global scale that would aggregate to make a sufficient difference. And that's hence my impetus to write a book called Rewriting the Human Story, how our story determines, or at least frames, our future. And in a sense, I totally am following Karl Popper's kind of idea, if you will. Am I not?
Well, certainly we can reframe things. Yes,
or a framework.
Yeah, try to reframe them. And he was very insistent that a kind of pessimistic reading of the future was self-fulfilling almost. That we needed to have an optimistic outlook on things, to have the determination to make the changes that we could make, but those changes were going to lead to always going to lead to unintended consequences and to a muddle that would, every attempted solution would create new problems, and problems that we can't really anticipate until we start to put these attempted solutions into effect. So I think we're always going to have a series of muddles and crises to contend with in ways that we can't foresee.
Was it Fred Pollock who said that, after evaluating all the greatest empires, said that empires die of suicide, not of murder?
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps you could say the same about, quote, the human empire as a civilization, perhaps. And speaking of the importance of that positive story, let me bring a quote here that comes to my mind here. This is Fred Pollock writing in 1961. He says, quote, "Any student of the rise and fall of cultures cannot fail to be impressed by the role played in this historical succession by the image of the future. The rise and fall of images precede or accompany the rise and fall of cultures. As long as a society's image is positive and flourishing, the flower of culture is in full bloom. Once the image begins to decay and lose its vitality, however, the culture does not long survive."
I mean, I do feel that the bloom has certainly gone off the United States of America. That the self-confidence that drove it so powerfully since the 18th century has really vanished, and I hope things don't turn out as darkly as some of the clouds on the horizon are suggesting.
And the same could be said for the Western world in general, because we tend to underplay or undervalue our accomplishments of democracy and perhaps overfocus on its failings rather than its accomplishments, and therefore fail to properly appreciate the benefits versus the cost. You know, I grew up in communism, so and I became Canadian by choice, not by birth. So for me, it's very obvious and very precious, and I'm very much aware of what I have, because I didn't have it for a very long time, and I had to fight to get it, to struggle to get it. But most people around me, it seems, in the West, kind of take it for granted and now don't see the benefits as much as the costs and the problems. And that's why I say that we need this new image, this new story, this new revolution that could be triggered by a new myth or a new story, or myth, as Popper would say.
Yes, well, that's something that other people have been working on too. Stephen Pink has been trying to make us realize that our story is actually one of incredible progress over the last few centuries. I'm not quite sure how you are going to do it, but I look forward to seeing what you do, and then perhaps inspiring, making the world, letting loose a virus that will cure us all rather than sicken us all.
Yeah, a good story is an idea virus, exactly, and that's how you measure how good is it, by how viral it is. Because when someone hears a good story, if they turn around, if they can't help but turn around and tell that story to the next person they see, that's how you know you have a good story. And you know, that happened to me back in the day when I first read about stories such as the technological singularity and artificial intelligence, and it took me many years to realize that those are not the best stories we have and we should have, for a number of reasons, and they have big problems. It took me a long time to realize that, unfortunately. But that's happened today with other people, with Bitcoin or with the internet back in the day. And I'm not saying those are good or bad stories. I'm just saying that it has happened to many of us. We've experienced it. Now we just need to find one that unites us to address our problems, our civilization-wide global problems. But anyway, let's bring our conversation to an end here, because I feel like it's becoming a monologue, and that's definitely not a good idea or my intention at all. So let me ask you this, Professor Boyd, where can people find more about you and your work?
There's you can Google me Wikipedia, or there's on the University of Auckland website, you can find me some of my story. I mentioned earlier that I'm curious in all sorts of different directions. So there are many people who know my literature and art and evolution work who don't really connect with my work on Nabokov, which is quite different, and my work on Popper mostly hasn't been published yet. But I mentioned to you my involvement in an art exhibition on the origin of art.
In Tasmania.
Yes, the director and founder of the Museum of Old and New Art happened to be a keen Nabokov fan and a keen fan of evolution, and he didn't realize that the two Brian Boyds were the same Brian Boyd.
I would say very few people would, and I kind of underplayed that part of your biography, which is a major part, which you touched on with the fact that you very early in your life had kind of this kind of keen interest in Nabokov's work. So that's absolutely phenomenal that you have these kind of two dimensions to you among many others. But what's one question about stories today that I should have asked you and I never did?
Well, I don't know that it's one that you should have asked me, but when you put this question to me, it comes to mind. Some people try to claim that there are a limited number of stories, a limited number of plots, and I find so there are 7 basic plots, there are 5 basic plots, there are 35 basic plots. the number depends on who's telling the story, but it seems to me that stories are infinitely recombinable. It's like language itself. There's no limit to the number of sentences that can be said even in just one language, and there's no limit to the number of stories that can be told.
Wow. And then would that lead us to kind of perhaps the best way to wrap our conversation up? In other words, what in your opinion is the best message that you want to send us away with? How we touched on so many things, and I'm not sure if I did a good job of kind of like directing our conversation today, because there are so many ideas. How can we make sense of it, or send our audience today with a single message that kind of wraps it up in the best way possible, in your view?
Well, the predicament we're in is complicated. There will always be new complications that we can't foresee, but on the other hand, without a confidence in the future, without a sense that we can make a difference to our own story, we won't get anywhere. So if we keep trying, we'll keep discovering new problems, but we will also be able to solve many, at least provisionally. And I think we shouldn't be disheartened about the complexity of the problems that we face.
So don't be disheartened about the complexity of problems that you face, because there's an infinite number of stories that we can draw upon to help us resolve those.
I think stories are very good at feeding us information, but they can't cope with the complexities of the unknowns of the next 5 or 10 years. So we're going to have to grapple in the shifting present with complications that stories in the past will be a partial guide to, but we also have to make our own decisions, partly in the unknown, and it's always going to be difficult. But I think the idea that there was a simpler time when stories provided the stories of religions they provided clarity about everything you did. I think they're slightly mythical, that things have always seemed complicated to people in the present. Retrospectively, we can see what happened and that disasters didn't occur and so on, and that we were totally unnecessarily fearful of these disasters. But yeah, we're always going to be in a very, very complicated situation, but we can win through.
Professor Boyd, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.